Hi, folks. So I just published this blog post on my website yesterday, and I wanted to make a video going over some of the main ideas in the post. I'm not gonna read it out, but I just want to talk through the main concepts here. The primary observation is that it is now pretty common to see people write code, quote unquote, in natural language. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the way these CLI coding agents have caught fire, they all have mechanisms where you can define custom commands or entire workflows simply in plain text in Markdown files. Before this, even things like cursor rules allowed you to do this. For example, in Claude Code, you can write these customs slash commands which will simply allow you to write out a full workflow simply as a list of bullet points in Markdown. And all the CLI agents have some similar feature with minor syntactic differences. And while the initial uptake of this was for very developer-centric workflows, recently, a lot of people have started using these CLI coding agents essentially as everything agents. So if you look at this really interesting Twitter thread, Alex Albert, it's Devrel at Anthropic, people have chimed in with all the non-coding use cases that they are using Claude Code for. And then there's also this really interesting thread from another person at Anthropic where they are running Claude Code from their home directory, not a Git repo. And again, using it as an everything agent. So for every task that you would usually click around for or type commands into a shell for. And that is really interesting. So people are using these CLI agents for tons of non-coding use cases and as everything agents, essentially. I find it amusing that this is the normie version of the conundrum that developers face all the time, which is, should I take an hour or two to write a script to automate something I do often? Or should I just this one more time go ahead and do it manually? This is a choice that developers often face in their day-to-day work. And now most non-technical people are facing a similar choice where they could either write out a plain text markdown file with their workflow that explains the steps and so on, or they could just do it manually. So this is really coding because you are automating things. You are specifying a set of steps to take. It just happens to be in natural language. And because it's in natural language, it enables a ton of new things that you couldn't have done with shell scripts or Python scripts. So for example, one very common use case is look at the diff and write a descriptive commit message, follow our company style guide at such and such URL. And this kind of semantic task is pretty easy and commonplace with these LLM-based agents. But of course, you couldn't have done a semantic task like this with a shell script. Now, if you look at most of the usage of LLMs out there, they are stuck in what I like to call chatland. And chatland is this informal Q&A mode of using AI and LLMs. Of course, it was started by ChatGPT back when it first came out. And you basically ask questions or run one-shot prompts, but it is good for exploration, but it's not repeatable and it is not workflow automation. Using ChatGPT in Chatland is a very, very different experience and modality than using, say, Claude Code to run a full multi-step workflow end to end. And there's a whole bunch of tools that are now pretty popular that try to construct more end-to-end workflows. Things like N8N, Gumloop, there's many others in this category where their key abstraction is a flowchart. So they all have a drag and drop UI that lets you construct flowcharts where each box is a step and you connect the boxes to each other. And that works fairly well for a lot of use cases, but it can be very fiddly. So it's not exactly natural language. You're still dragging and dropping boxes. And the data binding is not very well specified or rigorous. I covered a recent paper by Eric Meyer over here, and in this paper he covers a system called Universalis, which brings this kind of lightweight data binding to natural language LLM prompts. And that is, I think, a much better abstraction than dragging and dropping flowcharts. But looking beyond that a little bit, when businesses do document their workflows, they usually write SOPs, standard operating procedures, which are basically just detailed natural language descriptions of their processes. They are the much more detailed and serious versions of these 1 or 2 page custom slash commands that we are now writing with things like Claude Code. Okay, so you might ask, what is the problem? Why can we not make the leap from Chatland into workflow automation? And I think the main bottleneck is what I call the pain of articulation. This is more of a human problem than a technical problem. In another recent blog post, I was writing about how it is very rare to find a company that has a well-defined workflow that they want to agentify or use AI to help with. They know they want to do something with AI, that they want to automate things, they want to be more efficient, but they can't quite articulate their exact workflow, what the various inputs to that workflow are, what the various decision points are, what is the logic of that workflow. And around that same time, Ethan Mollick wrote this really insightful post on his Substack where he looked at how organizations actually organize their processes. So he looks at this paper that tries to map out processes inside a company. And what they found was they realized how much of the work seemed strange and unplanned. They discovered entire processes that produced outputs nobody used, weird semi-official pathways, and repeated duplication of effort. And there's a funny anecdote over here. A manager walked the CEO through the map with a view he had never seen before, and illustrating for him the lack of design and the disconnect between strategy and operations. The CEO put his head on the table and said, "This is even more effed up than I imagined." And I didn't know that there was actually a name for this. This is called the garbage can model of the organization. And so Ethan Mollick is making a similar point, which is that most large organizations do not have clear, well-documented workflows. And the point he tries to make in that post is very aligned with Richard Sutton's bitter lesson, which is that just don't even try to extract or document these workflows that humans were doing to get at a particular output. Just look at the output itself and let the AI follow its own path to reproducing that output. And this is why I think evals and benchmarks are so important when you're designing agents, because it's those evals and benchmarks which encode what good looks like. Never mind the human process you took to arrive at that. Now, note that all these problems we've been talking about are not going to get solved by more intelligent models. These are not model intelligence problems. These are human and organizational problems. Both OpenAI and Google have achieved gold medal level performance on the International Math Olympiad. This is the very pinnacle of cognitive difficulty that humans can solve. There's maybe a single digit number of people in the entire world that can achieve similar performance on these exams. But as the author is saying here, the bottleneck isn't intelligence, it's in specifying intent. So to wrap up, I think that what developers are doing with all these CLI agents, CLI coding agents, are basically speed running the same thing that enterprises need to eventually do. Developers are using CLI agents to specify and then automate end-to-end workflows simply with natural language. And I don't think most companies are there yet. And they need to do that in order to see the benefits of AI. They have to get out of chat land and into the land of workflow automation. All right, thanks. I'll leave a link to the blog post below.